Recording is in progress. Yeah, it's all recorded. Yeah, so welcome. And yeah, if you are watching me in the past or the future, welcome too. So here we are, Old Testament 2. Now, have you guys completed all of the first series?
Is there 6 modules now?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I've
Done 3. Sounds, because you were at the graduation too, weren't you? 6. Yeah. How many have you done, Luke?
Well, I didn't sit the exam. It's big. Why I've not? That's why I've not.
Yeah.
Why I've not.
Yeah. Well, you know, exams have a purpose and a function that some people need. I'm the type of person who needs an exam in order to get something done. And some people don't need. Some people learn quite efficiently without the need of an exam or an assessment hanging over them. I tend to need that sort of deadline myself, but depends how you are. So whether it's doing it this way or that way, as long as it's helping you learn, I find. All right, how about I pray for us? Our Father God, thanks so much for another season of School of Ministry. Thanks that we can be together in your word. Pray for those who can't be with us today, either through sickness or other commitments and travelling. We pray that you'll keep them safe. We pray that you'll return them to us soon and that we will enjoy learning together from your word. We thank you for the great story that the Old Testament provides us, and we pray as we dive into that story and inhabit it and think through it, that it will lead us to your Son Jesus, and we will see his glory even brighter than we have before. Amen. All right. Well, let me ask you this. Why do this course? Welcome. Come on in.
This is a black sort of thought this was going to be.
There's been a... Yes. Okay. I'll explain that. Grab a seat, and there's some notes here. We haven't even kicked off, so you haven't missed anything.
Well, we prayed.
Well, we prayed.
We prayed. You did pray. I saw you. Good chair.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Yep. There's more chairs. Yep. Grabbing more chairs. We were intending, and it was intending at the beginning of the year, I think, it was intended to do this at Blackstone. But the feedback I got from the previous group was the difficulty in getting everything set up and running on time.
There were exceptions to that feedback.
Okay.
That's right.
And I that's the feedback that I had at the time. And what hasn't changed probably in some areas, I chased down what I could, but maybe the advertising in some areas didn't chase down enough of the Blackstone references. The clash from week to week was what we're trying to avoid. I'm not sure. It might be that the case that there is another group now that we have 2 streams running, that the 3:30 p.m. group, which is stream 1, this is, or band 1, this is band 2. Band 1 might be using the Blackstone building, I'm not sure. So my apologies that hasn't been made clear to everyone.
It is good to see you, though. Can I say?
It's good to see you.
Do you guys know? No.
I think I've seen you.
You've seen him, and many more people have heard him. He was the voice on one of our Christmas
that's
tours.
True. Yeah, I had to get him to speak more.
Yes, get him to talk about Christmas crackers.
So just to say, I haven't registered for this. I just thought
that's okay.
Yep.
Dip in and see what it's like.
Because I thought, well, this would be nice and convenient. I can just go to it after the service.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Which is exactly right. Technically we still can.
Yes. Well, so one of the things we are doing is I'm presently recording this session. You can do it in 3 different ways. Live, which is by far the best way to do it, in the room so that we can all interact, bounce off each other, sharpen each other up. You can do it on Zoom, and that's obviously something that different people need from time to time because of COVID, sickness, isolation, travel, all those sorts of things. And it's also recorded. So if you wish to record, catch up, review, or do it when you're not suffering from a infection, then you can do it that way. So 3 different options really, as long as we get it together. So when you register with Moore College, you'll get access to all of the materials online, and you can, and that comes with the normal registration of $50 or $55.
Can I also tell you too, though, at the graduation, and looking forward to you guys graduating soon, they said that we've got 5-year membership.
5-year membership
to their Moore College. I gather it's the library.
Yeah. Oh, right, to the library.
Or to, whatever.
Wow.
You'll find out about that.
That is really, really good. That's a big value.
Graduation.
I did. We went.
Well, if you have access to the library, let me commend you. That's not a bad day out. If you like reading and you like chasing ideas, because that's one of the, I'll probably sound like a nerd, but it's one of the funnest things to do in the library is chase an idea and find a book, find a reference, and keep going and see where it leads you. Always good fun. So much better than learning like just whatever the topic you're chasing and just getting the material. The amount of things you discover and the rabbit holes you go down in Moore College Library are incredible. So, go for it. So 3 different ways we can do it. And 4th way is just doing it straight through Moore College. You don't need to do this. This is to help us. This is where we think that learning is done better in community, in a group. But you guys know that already. That's why you're still here. That's why you keep coming back. So the privilege is ours to share together. So let me ask you why do this course? What are you hoping to see happen for you in this course?
Well, to me, it's just about delving deeper into the Bible. So how it all connects together.
Go deeper in the Bible.
I put some quite interested.
Yeah, I think doing the prophets as a group would be helpful. I've looked at this prophet and I've looked at that prophet, just bits and pieces here and there, but not.
Yep.
So
because it's a lot of material, isn't it? Yeah. And you often, and it's narrative material. So I think you should expect it will draw you in ways that you might not have anticipated as well. So a lot of this material I studied at more when I was in 1st year, and then you sort of come over parts of it again in 2nd year. But in 1st year, you did a lot of this former prophets, and I think I discovered that I just didn't know much at all. And most of my exam preparation was just simply reading all of the Old Testament prophets again, the former prophets. I just read and read and read and read it. And I'm thinking, oh man, I should be writing notes. I should be doing something else. But I found other people's notes, which was helpful. But I just spent most of my time reading. And that's what I want to encourage you to do throughout this course. Just read, just fall into the story, and let it, swim in it for a while. I think that's one of the best ways forward. Anything else? Any other things you're hoping to get out of this course?
I'd probably say for me, it's about either confirming or rectifying what I previously learned and understood. So, there's somewhere in my brain is this collection of readings or sermons or, sessions of whatever I've been to.
Yeah.
And, whether I've got them ordered or what have you, or whether I've sort of skewed them, I guess that's what helps. Yeah, with a focus on that. So,
yeah. And particularly if you haven't read much of it since childhood or had time to delve into it. One of the things I discovered was in Sunday school, you learn about kings and battles and all these sorts of things. And as a young boy, you're excited by armies, fights, killing, blood, sex. It's all there. And you and as you become older, as I did, I learnt about grace and the shape of the gospel that is imprinted into all of the whole Bible. And going back through the Old Testament again, learning that, just brought it all back to life in a way that I'd never really seen before. So that was good. Yeah. All right. So this is where we are. So the purpose of this unit is to give you really a brief. It is going to be fast. We're going to fly low over the land, but at a high speed, I guess. But it'll give you an overview of the former prophets, So, and we want to, I guess, you are able then to have that overview or bird's eye view of the historical movements as well that are covered by the former prophets. So strap yourself in; it's going to be good. So we're looking at a period of the former prophets from Joshua through Judges, 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, and they cover that period of history through the entry to Canaan, and I guess the exit out during the exile of both the northern and the southern kingdoms. We'll come to that north-south thing in a minute too. So
the sermon series we have on Judges will be very helpful.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Joshua.
Yes, we did Joshua last year, did we? Yeah. And Judges this year. Can't remember if we're going to do if we've scheduled in 1 and 2 Kings, but that would be. Actually, we did
once.
Yes, that's right. We did 1 and 2 Samuel, didn't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, about 2-3 years ago, maybe longer.
About 2 Samuel.
No, definitely did 2 Samuel as well. We come back around. We might have done 1 Samuel quite a while back and then 2 Samuel.
You mentioned Sunday school, what you learned from Sunday school. A lot of it was our congregation. During the Judges 7 was saying things like, my goodness, that's not what we learned at Sunday school.
Yeah, that's right.
I know. I grew up thinking Samson was a good person. No.
All the kings are good side.
Turns out that he's a womanizing sex addict with anger issues. Yeah. Anyone know why they're called the former prophets?
Someone's PhD.
The pre-exile prophets.
Yeah, I think it's just,
The others are from the exile on.
Yeah, the latter ones after the big event in Israel's history, which was their exile from the land. Yeah.
So these prophets were before the exile.
Yes. Yeah. And although they're writing from that period, about that period, you would expect though that the writer of 1 and 2 Kings is looking back, because 1 and 2 Kings is really explaining what happened according to the why this happened. But even as we looked at Judges a few months ago, a few weeks back, near the end of Judges, it gives a mention of that. I can't remember specifically what it was, but that it was like this way up until the captivity of the land. Just a little slip in there almost. It's like, oh yeah, you're writing from that perspective. You're looking back. So there's that as well.
I mean, it's interesting that Moses is not considered in the context of being a prophet. I mean, he was a whole other things as well. But all the references go back to Moses. So,
yeah. But I guess you're looking at the Torah, the first 5. No, sorry, is it Torah? Do we call it the Torah? No, what do we call it?
Yeah.
The first 5?
Yeah,
Pentateuch, that's the word I was looking for. Are sort of attributed to Moses, almost all of it, apart from where he writes about his own death. Yeah,
that's right.
yeah, and then the rest are looking back. So they're really, because they are looking, because it does end in the exile, they're looking at things from God's perspective. It's a theological commentary on all these events of Israel's history. And so you're reminded again and again of what happened, why it happened specifically, what they should have been doing, what they shouldn't have been doing. And I guess it's emphasising God's judgment, God's salvation, God's word in the context of the history that is happening. So let me read you this. This is from Joshua 23, 14 to 15. And it says this, I am now going the way of all the earth. You know with all your heart, with all your soul, that none of the good promises the Lord your God made to you has failed. Everything was fulfilled for you. Not one promise has failed. Since every good thing the Lord your God promised has come about, so he will bring on you every bad thing until he has annihilated you from this good land the Lord your God has given you. Sounds like a positive and a negative parting shot from Joshua. So he's, you know, it's going some way to say this is the perspective that we're looking for. You know, this is what God has provided, salvation, and he will judge. And he will do what he said, both the good and the bad parts. Right. So let's look at the time that we're thinking of. Let's get myself out of the way. We're in this where, well, I guess we're also including, I don't know why that's not quite, we're not going to spend, I don't think we're going to spend too much time in the Judges, actually. Oh, no, we will, actually. We should really include that Judges, this square. But, yeah, we're looking through from the period of the Judges after, and the Conquest. We haven't got that on there either. What you do have is, if you have a look either online or if any of you have ordered the book, you'll have a more detailed timeline in the appendix of that. But we're looking at the period, from the Conquest through to when, Saul and David and Solomon, when the kingdoms divide north and south, where we end up with both north and south going into exile at different periods. All right. So we're going to just do a brief run through of the whole of it. This today is a bit of an overview of the whole course, what we're going to cover, and talk through just some of those things. So we're going to talk through that timeline and where we're going to begin. So we're going to begin with the Conquest at about 1400 BC. So there is going to be some sort of contention about dates because scholars have to look at various things. Archaeologists look at various things to find when certain things happen, and not always will they agree. So 13th century BC date is what most scholars give for Exodus, the Exodus. And there is, varying accounts of archaeological evidence for the conquest going through Canaan. Yet the Bible suggests a 15th century date. And we've got some, I guess where we get those things from are some of these passages. The time the Israelites lived in Egypt was 430 years. And then we've got other time markers like in Judges. Israel lived in 300 years in Heshbon and its villages. And in 1 Kings 6, Solomon began to build the temple of the Lord in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of the land of Egypt. So some of those things can be dated a little bit easier, and then we can work back from there. So what that tells us, apparently, I don't know where the date markers are exactly, but it tells us that Israel were taking possession, conquering the land around the mid to late Bronze Age. But often we skip over those little markers there for dates, but they are important to look at. The other, I guess, argument that's going on in the background of a lot of biblical studies is whether the Bible is being treated itself as an artifact, as an archaeological artifact. A lot of this big debate that goes on about whether it's a biased account, and therefore should it be ruled out. But
that's right. They're mostly written by the winners.
Yeah.
So they have a perspective.
That's right. Every historical account has some bias, and it's written by the winners. But can you ask that completely? Can you ask that truly of the story that you read in the scriptures? Like, they're not always the winners, are they? In fact, there's a lot of stuff in there that you would, if you wanted to give an account of how awesome you were, you'd probably leave that bit out.
Yeah, there's certain events in the Bible recorded, which are sort of counter cultural, historical, which suggests
if you want to cast Abraham as the hero of your faith, the founder of your faith, you probably wouldn't. You probably leave out the inconvenient parts, like he basically threw his wife into the mess.
So many examples.
Yeah. If you're going to have a law system that specifically says you must not marry one woman and then marry a sister, you'd leave out the account of Jacob with Rachel and Leah. That's not cool. You do lots of things. You'd leave out lots of stuff. But so
often what's cool at the time that's recorded. So it's not cool anymore.
Yeah. Or but it might not be cool. But in the context of when of the transmission of that text and held up as the story of who we are and where we've come from, they haven't cut out those parts that you might expect them to.
So the significance of dating around the late Bronze Age, is that sort of bringing something else into play?
I think it's more of a marker so that you can look at what else is happening in the late Bronze Age technologically. So there is reference to technology that's significant to the story that we read in Judges. Iron chariots, that they could not conquer parts of what Judah were meant to conquer. They were forced to stay up in the hill country. They couldn't come down among the plains for a period because they had iron chariots, couldn't really move them. And then later on, the iron chariots turn up with Sisera leading the army. They get stuck in the mud. That's the references to things like that are handy to take note of and think about what's going on in that period.
The beginning of fortified cities and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it sort of highlights, effectively from Abraham onwards, you get this sense of a military component to the gospel, to Israel's presence.
Yeah.
And so I can see the historical connection.
All right, so we move after that into the period of the Judges, and we've taken a good look at Judges here in the last preaching series, and that's after Joshua has divided up the land, and then, but we're still in a period where there's no sort of central control and command, and you get a very good picture of what that means for Israel as different tribes. Eventually, by the end of it, are really going to war with each other and tearing each other apart.
That constant refrain. In those days, there was no king. Everyone did what was right in the world.
Yeah, in those days, yeah, Israel had no king. Although they did have a king in Yahweh, their God, they ignored him and didn't want him as king. And you noticed also in Judges that no organised armies, so it was always kind of dependent on a fairly charismatic character to draw people together. And some of them were good, like Gideon, were goodish. Deborah, good. Barak, okay. But then Abimelech, oh, whoops.
It's interesting that Switzerland still has that system. Basically, every man's part of the army is the end of an army.
Right, okay.
They don't have a...
Didn't know that about Switzerland. Right, every man is in the Swiss army. Something to boast about at a party, I suppose. Yeah.
Switzerland does tend to sit out in most conflicts.
Yeah, that's true. Might be why. Might be something in that. There's also the constant struggle through Judges with the worship of foreign gods, and the cycle or the spiral, as we've described it, which is going to come up and keep coming and keep plaguing Israel again and again. And you're told at the beginning of Judges that God, in the end, I guess, gave them what they wanted. He left certain peoples among them to test them. And one of the things we see, yes, as we go on through the Old Testament, is that syncretism, that where they take on a bit of what they have in Yahwistic or religion and mix it with some of the local flavours. And that particularly happens, as we'll see later on, in the northern tribes after the kingdom split. And yet throughout that, one of the things we did see in the refrain of Judges was just how faithful and involved and even positively and negatively for positive outcomes, God kept intervening with his people. He didn't just turn their back and leave. All right. So when we kick into 1 Samuel, we meet the last judge of Israel. We meet Samuel. But he also acts as a priest for Israel, which Saul failed to recognise, and for the first king, and a prophet. And that's, you see the transition from the various tribes to a united monarchy, but it's a fairly, as we might have seen through 1 and 2 Samuel, it's a fairly long and arduous thing. It doesn't just happen straight away. It's a lot of conflict involved. Earlier Iron Age, apparently, this is what we're talking about. So again, changes in technology, changes in societal structures, changes in the way cities operated and stuff like that. And other powers arising around them, like the Philistines, which we see plenty of, and the technology that they bring. And so we get to that particular transition as seen in 1 Samuel 8, which I've sort of summarised there. When Samuel grew old, they said to him, "You're old." It's nice to hear always hear. "Your sons do not follow your example. We need a king like all the other nations have." And that was really the key to the problem, as predicted back in Deuteronomy 17 as well. God knew that this would happen, that they would get to this point. They would ask for a king like all the other nations. Wasn't that the problem that we identified back with Samson in Judges? He wanted to be like every other man. He didn't want to fight the Philistines. He wanted to marry them. And the only fights that he got in with them, that he got involved with them, was when they had personally affronted him. And so he wasn't interested in doing God's work, although wonderfully, amazingly in that story, God says, no, I've chosen you and I will use you, which is kind of what he's saying to Israel. I've chosen you, I will use you for my glory, for my purposes, and never actually, I won't let you go. He's faithful like that. And the people here are doing a similar thing. They want to be like all the other nations. They don't want to be God's special people anymore. They instead of looking to him for their safety and security, they're looking to the structures of government around them, the people around them. You know, maybe it's a pomp and ceremony of having a king, someone that you can point to. And God concedes to that. He says, listen to them and appoint a king for them, which we'll discover doesn't turn out too great. So that's the transition, 1100 to 1000 BC. And then we transition into that monarchy period where we see King Saul, who doesn't last too long, although 40 years, I think, is reasonable. David assumes the throne, or is given the throne, sorry. Jerusalem becomes the capital. The Philistines are subdued. It's back and forth, but you get a pretty good picture early on in the chapters that this back and forth with the Philistines is really not because the Philistines are strong. It's because the Israelites keep refusing to listen to God, to trust him. We have another big turning point of David wanting to build a temple for God, but God coming back to him saying, no, you're not going to build it. I will build, there it is in verse 11, the Lord himself will make a house for you. Turning the tables in some sense. And your house and your kingdom will endure before me forever, and your throne will be established forever. One of the key promises in the Old Testament that a lot will hinge off and makes a lot more sense of the New Testament as we travel towards that. And so then you see that particular high point in Israel's history come with Solomon. And a lot of the key indicators, you're into that sort of thing, KPIs, key performance indicators of promises that seem to appear at that point. The borders of Israel are safe and secure, so God's people are in the place, in the land. And Solomon, when he gets started, appears to be wise, trusting. He unites Israel, and God is there filling the temple, with his presence. And all people from other nations from around the world are coming to Solomon to get a taste, to get a whiff of his wisdom. And so we start to see the blessing that God had promised to Abraham way back in Genesis chapter 12 starts to flow out to all the other nations. So this is the way it's meant to be. But it doesn't last long.
It's interesting that the nations valued wisdom.
Yep.
We don't seem to value wisdom much these days.
Well, we I guess, do we not value wisdom, or do we just have a different definition of wisdom?
We value wisdom. There's a financial component attached to it.
Yeah. Yep. There's that.
That's what lessons do you learn?
Yeah, I do think we value wisdom.
Because it's judgment calls all along the way.
That's right.
Whether it's yourself or you deciding on behalf of others. What was I reading this morning? ABC News about what's the country bordering Russia that seems to be
Belarus.
Yeah. And it's and this bloke is basically cornered in every possible way. It's his own stupidity as a dictator, but so
he's the democratically elected head of the country that's been there for 42 years.
What, based on his own account?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just, yeah, you just see the wisdom is what he's craving for to get out of his predicament. But he's created it all the way. So anyway, I guess that's what I was sort of making.
But there's a wisdom that today that says, you know, that's based on a long trajectory of ideas and philosophy and values that have brought us to this moment today, where lots of things are said that even 10, 15 years ago would be absurd. Things said around, you know, the individual, sexuality, all sorts of things like that. It's not something. It's something that's sort of, you know, come up in that particular way recently, but it has a long history of, you know, of changes in thinking, changes in technology, the Industrial Revolution, other political revolutions, all contribute to the philosophy that seems to dominate in our day. It's very interesting to sort of trace that back, but you'll see that happen across the pages of the former prophets as well. And you'll be able to see the changes in thinking that occur over that period of time. And not just, I mean, foundationally you go, that's because people rejected God. Sure, you can say that, but it doesn't necessarily answer the question of why did they do it then in that way? Because, you know, I heard a professor put it this way recently. He said, he asked his students, why did the Twin Towers in New York come down? Why did they collapse? Why did they do that? And the answer is gravity. Like, they came down because gravity pulled them down, but that doesn't actually tell you anything, does it? There's a whole lot of other stuff that led to that moment, that contributed to that, that cascaded various causes, you know, into that moment. And it's just, we've got to read history like that as well. And particularly we've got to read, I think if we want to read the former prophets wisely, it's true to say, yes, it's sin, but there's a lot more going into that. And I think we learn a lot about ourselves too when we think about more deeply about what particular is happening in the politics, in technology, in the way people were living, the movements of the day. Gives us more insight into ourselves, because then that's when we start to recognise, oh yes, I know it's sin, but I'm thinking what he was thinking. Or I'm feeling what they're feeling.
That's a sermon today from Corinthians. I said to Gary, when we always read that passage and have a sermon, we always miss one word when we talk about sin, that's greed. And that's the one that...
Self-interest.
Self-interest.
Yeah. Sometimes the way we talk about sin can abstract it to the point where it doesn't actually it's just a concept. Yeah. And so we, particularly as we go through, that's the challenge with the former prophets, is to not let it be so abstracted in history that we just give it an abstract title like sin and don't actually nuance it into what's going on in the day, in the hearts and the minds of the people. So after Solomon, the kingdom becomes a divided kingdom. It's divided because of Solomon's sin, but the way it happens, the nuance of the time, is through some very poor leadership of his son Rehoboam, some bad advice of the people that were around him, and the conditions that had led up to this moment. We discover that Solomon was a hard taskmaster, that he had indeed done what Samuel had predicted a king would do. He would take the best of everything. And the people, we discover, had to some degree been reeling under that. So there's not just Rehoboam or it's not just Solomon's sin. There's a lot more going into it that causes this to happen. So let's see where we are. Yep, the two kingdoms. So when all Israel, this is from 1 Kings 12, saw that the king had not listened to them, that's Rehoboam, the people answered him, what portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. Israel, return to your tents. David, now look after your own house. So Israel went to their tents, but Rehoboam reigned over the Israelites living in the cities of Judah. So we have this north-south divide, Jeroboam in the north, ruling over 10 tribes, Rehoboam keeping 2 tribes in the south, naming it the kingdom of Judah, but it's Judah and the small tribe of Benjamin. And we know why Benjamin is so small, because they all got slaughtered. Okay, so another big turning point in the history of Israel that doesn't just it happens particularly in a way that leaves Israel very weak. So you think of that high point of Israel, it wasn't a particularly long high point of Israel. Yeah.
What did it start about after life 2 for Solomon? Because he had 700 wives and 300 concubines.
That mind boggles, doesn't it?
Yes.
A lot of them would have been diplomatic marriages, I think.
Either way, there was a connection.
Yeah.
I mean, all I can think of is, flamingos, and, there they are, and it's going on. And, that noise of how do you, whether it's women or blokes, it'd be the same issue about trying to get them united.
Yeah.
And I just can't fathom it.
I think also, when you think of the discovery that we get that, Solomon did have a high point, but by the time his son takes the throne, we discover people aren't actually happy. They've been under the thumb a little bit. And he starts, where did those 700 wives and 300 concubines come from? Like, drawn from all the families of Israel. There would have been families who possibly didn't get as much of a say in that. Maybe the whole idea of a marriage to the king was devalued because you're just one of 1,000. Yeah, there's lots of other stuff that we could see going on there. So with the two kingdoms, we end up with the northern kingdom. And one of the things you will hear from the northern kingdom is again and again and again the sin of Jeroboam and the things that happen there. No, we don't have a reference to that. But Jeroboam is concerned that his 10 tribes, Israel, will travel down to Judah, where the temple is, and where Israel were meant to worship. That will lose his influence and possibly economically lose as people continue to pilgrimage down there. So he says, no, that's too far for you to do that. I'll set one up in the north and south of my kingdom, so that in Dan and Bethel, so that you don't have to go all that way to worship. Just worship here. And of course, that becomes, again, a syncretistic kind of religion. It mixes in with the local flavours. They end up, worshipping idols. And again throughout the former prophets, you'll find, because, the refrain of because of the sin of Jeroboam, the sin of Jeroboam, the sin of Jeroboam. It's a very big deal of what's going on.
Because it then plays out when Jesus goes to the world in Samaritan.
Yes.
And the whole event of God's provision.
Mm-hmm.
There's a gap.
Yeah.
Knowledge that his sovereignty.
Yeah.
Disappears.
Yeah.
This is what happens in the Jews don't talk to each other.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I answered that. My phone just rang and I answered it. Oops. Okay. Yeah, that was my mum. Now we'll go to the southern kingdom. We'll look at the breakup. So let me read this to you from 2 Kings 17:5. And I guess it's again giving you the physical, historical references to what's happened. So then the king of Assyria invaded the whole land. So it's Assyria that's invaded. Marched up to Samaria. That was the capital of the northern kingdom. Besieged it for 3 years. Takes a while to take on it. Imagine being besieged in that day for 3 years. In the 9th year, Hoshea, the king of Assyria, captured Samaria, and he deported the Israelites to Assyria and settled them in Halah and by the Habor, Gozan's river, in the cities of the Medes. So this was a policy of the Assyrians: deport, disperse, and distract. Distract in that they'll end up again doing more, becoming more syncretistic, more, blended in.
So would that have been slaves?
I don't think so. Perhaps depending on what class of person you were perceived to be. I'd have to have a look, read through whether it was, but I think it's more about just dispersing and trying to modify what's the reason you would do it? You would disperse and distract all these people because you don't want them rising up against you.
It's re-education.
Yeah.
Take the lead.
Yeah.
I
So if you can take away people's identity, their national identity, blend them into everyone else, then even though you mightn't have one particular strong identity, you also don't have that also works for you. You don't have people rising up.
It's just because I had an ancient history class. They were talking about ancient Egypt and the building projects that they had there. When you think about the deserts and where they build things in Egypt, perfect for a slave environment because there's nowhere for them to run. It would be easier to manage them in a lot of these places. Slaves on building projects. The ancient Egyptians.
Now, it'll be interesting, particularly when we come to the Southern Kingdom, is to watch what happens to that policy over time. It actually changes with the regime changes as well, and profoundly affects the people of Israel. Then you get the commentary from verse 7. This disaster happened because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God. So there's the broad definition, but then it starts to come down, break it down a bit more. The God who had brought them out of the land of Egypt from the power of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. So it's reminding you that they were a weak people who didn't save themselves, didn't build themselves up. And because they had worshipped other gods. So they started to look, they started to synchronize with other religions around them. And they lived according to the customs of the nations that the Lord had dispossessed. So we're going back to Judges, and Joshua and Judges, and that the Lord had dispossessed before the Israelites, and the customs of the king of Israel had introduced, so the bad leadership. So you've got that broad, it was sin, but then you've got all the other stuff that's happened underneath that's brought them to this moment. So important to pay attention to that as we go along. Then the Southern Kingdom. Actually, this graph is helpful for us to see a little bit about what's happening at that time. So in the purple there, we're talking about that Northern Kingdom. So you've got the Assyria mainly coming from through the north there, and just dispersing everyone. And then the Babylonians later with the Southern Kingdom taking that. And then the Assyria pulling people back in from other lands into Israel. That's the other thing we didn't mention. That Assyria, part of their policy is to take people from other lands that they've conquered and stick them in Israel. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, we can see the picture there of what's happening with Judah, the southern kingdom, from 722 to 587, where they go into exile as well. So this is right at the end of the former prophets, kind of almost the last word. And yeah, in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, very specific, isn't it? King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon advanced against Jerusalem with his entire army. They laid siege to the city, built a siege wall against it all around. Interestingly, fairly specific about the technique, the strategy, or the tactics to get into Jerusalem. And there's very, very clear archaeological evidence of the Babylonians doing this, particularly in the city of Laish, which you can read about, which is referenced in the scriptures as well, that he attacked, built siege ramps against it and conquered it. And you can see those, I don't know if you can see the ramps or you can see the evidence of the ramps today. It's very interesting. This is where I got distracted as not so much as a Bible college student, but as a person. When I first did Introduction to the Bible, PTC, was reading stuff like this and reading it with a Bible dictionary open. And I had a fairly pictorial Bible dictionary, and like a quality one, but lots of pictures as well. And I would be reading that in the text and then looking it up in the dictionary and going, there's the water duct going into Jerusalem that he's mentioning. There's a picture of it. It just brought a lot of it to life. Yeah. So, you know, if you've got a good Bible dictionary, they're really worthwhile. And then another date reference in the 7th day of the 5th month, which was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, in case you're wondering. The commander of the guards, a servant of the king of Babylon, entered Jerusalem. So they breached the wall, and then what happens? The king of Babylon put them to death, those who had rebelled against him, and sent Judah into exile.
It's a long period of time to be having
Yeah.
Just against a city, because the rest of the land must have been subdued and carted off. I mean, it highlights the structure of Jerusalem, but also highlights the amount of resources poured in to keep an army going for years to be overthrown another city.
And how was the city surviving under siege for so long?
Ah, well.
They ate each other, didn't they?
Yeah, there's plenty to read. I like that. That's a big part of the tactic, isn't it? To basically starve people out.
Set outside and wait for them to surrender. Sometimes for years.
Yeah. But that's also how you survive a siege. You wait them out until they're on the wet. They're exposed. You're safe in your city if you can keep feeding yourself. Yeah, it's all part of the tactics.
Yeah, you need to have a good tunnel system to get out.
Well, the water duct into Jerusalem was, I think, part of that. All right. Well, there's 6 of us here, plus me. I'd like you to take a moment to have a look. There's an exercise there. We set in groups, but we can do this as individuals and then have a quick discussion. To read the opening and the closing of each of these former prophets and get an idea, or part of the opening and closing, they're not always exactly at the beginning, of what you should expect in each book. So just, skim it if you have to, if it's particularly, but just jot down a sentence of what you think you should expect from the opening and closing. So if we start, Lewis, with you, and we'll just go around. So if we can go, Lewis, with Joshua, Judges, Tony, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, and 2 Kings, Luke. All right. Anyway, We'll continue. So how did you go? So who wants to? Shall we kick off just in the same order? Joshua. What do you think the reader should expect in each book, in that book?
Look, I mean, you go through the detail, as you're preparing to go into the promised land. But I guess for me, what I was expecting to hear is that God would fulfill his promises with his people, and the people would respond, and it would become evident. That's probably the very quick summary. So
God would fulfill his promises, and the people would respond with faith and trust.
First generation.
No, the whole of Israel, because they've actually learned. I mean, this is Joshua, and now in the promised land. God's demonstrated, that he will fight their battles and bring them into this land. So it's a bit like happy, rosy type future type stuff. But it finishes with Joshua dying, and he's buried in the promised land. And Israel, and this is probably the alarm bell for me. It's Israel served the Lord during the time of Joshua and the elders, and that's the alarm bell. Being okay, so serve them, then what happened? So anyway, that's the very quick summary that I picked out with all the detail and the narrative about what was going on was that God was faithful, fulfilling his promises, and Israel was now an established nation in its land. So,
okay, good. What about Judges?
Well, I found that once Joshua died, it was okay about the first generation after that. And then the people fall away again. And then it seems to repeat itself as a cycle. And then, they fall away again, God comes back, he raises someone up to help lead them. And they do for a while, the worst one, and then they fall away again. So it's a cycle. It seems to repeat itself.
And it ends rather bleakly, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's at the end, it's just basically they went to their own tribes, do what they wanted to do. And so I guess it's just introducing it to the next book. You really left through Judges just going, something's got to give here. Something God's got to intervene in some big way and do something. They're not going to sort it out themselves. All right. What do you reckon?
I want Samuel. The top and tail in here is a little trickier to follow because we start with Samuel being called by the Lord and failing to understand it's the Lord. He was thinking it's Eli. And then
come on.
Not judging here, simply reporting. And then it ends with Saul being wounded on the battlefield and finishing himself off rather than being finished off and abused by the enemy. So the question is, how do we get from here to there? And
if you think what we were saying about Judges too, we're really looking for an intervention, and then you get God speaking to Samuel, directly calling him. And if you didn't have to read this part, but there's a very profound birth narrative to Samuel. So we've already at that point been introduced to the fact that this guy must be incredibly special in some way, and then God speaks. But then you compare that to the end, and there's no word of the Lord. There's no intervention. It's just this. They're losing to an enemy, and it's just this bleak and horrible picture of the one who was meant to be the king falling on his own sword in humiliation and defeat. Yeah, quite a contrast, really.
Well, particularly with Joshua, where things have been achieved, and now they don't even recognise who's actually calling.
Yeah. Well, how does it go in 2 Samuel then, Don?
Well, we start with David being anointed king, the blessing of David, and we finish with David sacrificing to the Lord. And through that, we have the trials and tribulations, challenges of David's kingship, going from involving one sense service to God and the other sense, of course, rebellion. So we go, what do I expect from that? Well, I expect the challenges of David's kingship. And the end that finishes with 2 powerful words. Would not the Lord have sacrificed offerings and fellowship? And the Lord answered his prayer on behalf of the land. The plague of Egypt was stopped.
Yeah, so Lord is answering his prayer. You compare that to the end of 1 Samuel. That is quite stark, isn't it? Yeah. And the way that we learn about David being a man after God's own heart, but also the contrast is that this is the king that God seeks out, whereas Saul was the king that the people sought. Even though God chose Saul for the people, he chose the king that the people wanted. Whereas this is the king that he wants. Yeah.
I mean, David did have some benefits, though, particularly having the hand of the Lord on him.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't all the time, but
yeah.
You know,
but in a way, that's setting you up for something else, isn't it? Like if David is a successful king, and he is pictured as a successful king, despite the terrible things that happen under him, he's pictured as a successful king because the hand of the Lord is on him.
Saul had the spirit of the Lord at the beginning as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because Psalm 51 is an interesting psalm because, you know, David goes through his dilemmas in that reflection, but it's also the fact that he realises as king of Israel that if he doesn't have the Lord with him, he'd end up like Saul. And he had effectively this rabble that he had to be a king of, and he couldn't do it without the hand of the Lord being with him. So, anyway,
yeah. So, but there's something that's setting us up for in that like Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. They get a king. It doesn't actually work that well, especially when this king decides to do things his way rather than the Lord's way. And then we have a king that, although he in his human nature is not perfect, the hand of the Lord is with him. And that is actually what makes Israel become the successful nation and ultimately, head towards that blessing that was to flow out through all nations. It needs the God-man to be the king. And, it's obvious what that's possibly setting us up for. All right. Well, how do we go with future kings in 1 Kings?
Well, it starts with David's advice to Solomon, which was basically to be the God king. And it finishes with a king of the south and a king of the north who did not acknowledge God. So you'd expect that the book would contain the downhill spiral from Solomon's initially was the God king, God's king, and then it all went pear-shaped. And the kingdom was divided, and the north at this stage had moved right away from God.
And which is interesting because when you interviewed Michael and Radi today, it was one of the things I was thinking of too. Because
I wouldn't think about in terms of Belgium.
Alice, who the mission is going to Belgium, and they've got these great, buildings, but effectively God has disappeared in the hearts and minds of the nation, except for maybe 1%. Is that what?
1.2%, something like that.
Christians. So it was interesting. The same type of reflection.
Hence what I was saying before. It's so important then when you're looking at the form of prophets and parts like that in the Bible, not to simply go, well, sin that caused them to, you know, all this to happen. That is true. You can say the same about Belgium. The sin caused people to walk away from God. Fine. It doesn't tell you how it happened. You actually need to do the work in your own culture and in your own history to look at what got us here. Where were the mistakes made along the way? Where did stuff slip in that the church particularly allowed and didn't speak up against? What was happening specifically? What was in the mind of the people that was happening that got them to this point? And we've got to do that work in the scripture, but we've also got to do that work with ourselves, with our own churches, so that we recognise these patterns and issues, even though they might be so small and seemingly insignificant, to go, you know, let history be our teacher to some extent and go, yeah, we've been here before. We did this before, or they did this in Belgium. And look what has happened. Look where it led. Yeah.
So when did you get the stat that Christian population in Belgium is 1.2%?
Oh, no, well, from Michael and Rani.
Oh, sorry, yeah, it was part of the
So you might have seen Michael and Rani come out to Blaxland a number of weeks ago. They were meant to do Blaxland one week and then Glenbrook the other. Yeah, but COVID and
something.
Yeah, but you had a video today about sending workers to the harvest, I think. But Michael and Rani are a young couple that are about to head off on their first term mission to Belgium. And Belgium is described as a gospel poor country, and they describe it to define that more finely as where the evangelical Christians in that country are unable to, that under-resourced and don't have enough people to take that mission further. Without the help and intervention from others outside of that country, they won't really go anywhere. So missionaries come in and help train and teach locals in the gospel, train them up for ministry, train them to do university ministries, to lead churches, ultimately getting to the point where they are at some countries, training people to teach in Bible colleges and stuff like that. So, but the statistic, I can't remember the exact number, but it was something like I can't remember if she said between 1% and 2% or 1.2% are considered Christians. It is, yeah. So either way,
by Christians, you mean Protestant evangelical?
Yes.
So you don't count Catholics as Christians?
No, I don't think they count Catholics as part of that mission. Yeah.
Because I mean, Belgium has historically been Catholic country.
Yeah. I've got a friend who's gone to Italy, and you might think, well, sending missionaries to Italy. But Catholicism, largely in Italy, from what she's told me, has, I guess similar to what we look at in the former prophets, it's actually in a large way quite syncretistic with paganism in some ways. In that you'll find in many churches and even outside of churches, there will be it'll be mainly about Mary and statues of Mary, and there will be even she showed us videos of where she'd been of people who have put offerings in front of these what have now become idols of Mary, leaving those offerings, leaving fruit, money, different things like that to protect them and keep them. And largely the churches across large parts of Italy are museums, effectively. You pay money to go in and look at them. You don't hear the gospel preached. So hence missionaries are going to places like even Italy. You can't, it's hard to imagine. How does that happen? The Vatican is in Rome. But so it has.
Yeah, no, I'm a little bit disturbed. I've seen it in Italy, but I'm a little bit disturbed. there's a bit of a tendency in the Protestant church to think Catholicism, by its very definition, doesn't mean Christian.
Yeah, look, and I think
that's what bothers me a bit.
Yeah.
I still maintain probably the most serving and loving Christian I ever taught perhaps in high school was a Catholic.
Yeah.
And he's gone into the priesthood.
Yeah.
And much to a lot of the girls' disappointment. But he was, yeah. And so I think we've got to be very careful to not always assume that Catholicism means not Christian. And I agree with your point totally about the crosses. Yeah,
I think where the contention comes, and it's probably best explained, is I would contend that there are many Catholics who are definitely and faithful Christians, followers of Jesus Christ. They put their trust in him for their salvation, right? But I would also contend that if you were to follow to the letter Catholicism as found in the Catholic confessions, I think they call it, or it's CCC, Catholic Confession something, then you will find in those official doctrines of the Catholic Church stuff that I think is clearly not of the gospel and not of the scriptures. So I know simplified statements don't always work. It's a simplified statement. I would say that there are many Catholics that are Christians, but a true Catholic is in someone who would uphold all of the Catholic doctrine. I find that hard to see that they could be Christian because then you're not upholding the sacrifice of Christ as sufficient. You're not upholding the authority of Scripture that stands alone above all other authorities, and a number of other things. So that's where I'd go with that. And I know that would even itself be quite hard. And then you have the secondary question, well, what do you do as a Christian in a Catholic church? That's a more complex question, and there'd be different contexts where you might say, no, stay, and other contexts where you'd say, no, leave. And that's a different thing altogether. Anyway, last one, 2 Kings. What do you reckon, Luke?
So it starts with so after King Ahab, the next king, Syria, gets an injury. So he goes and consults another god. So Elijah, the prophet, tells him he's going to die. So
there's a conflict with Elijah. There's an unfaithfulness to God, and there's a warning. This is not going to end well.
This doesn't end well. Doesn't end well. It's not how to go. And then the book ends with the fall of Jerusalem. Then Babylon is taking the good stuff and destroying the whole temple. So
Babylon come in and rip out all the top end of the people. They actually set up a proxy king for a while, or what do you call it, a vassal king? Is that the right word? And then at some point, even that king goes, nah, we can do away with Babylon, and God's on our side, and we'll be okay. I think that's where Jeremiah is speaking into, and then it's in saying no, this is not going to work out. And then finally, Nebuchadnezzar, that's it, had enough, comes in and strikes them all down.
It's just the whole book is about the decline of the Southern Kingdom.
Yeah, but that forewarning is fulfilled at the end, which a lot of Israel forgot. They forgot, God's on our side, God will bless us, God's given us the land, and failed to listen to his warnings, which is another thing to look at in the background, in the foundations of what's happening, and think of, have we listened to the word of the Lord, responded rightly to its call for us to reform and to trust. All right, we'll nearly finish up. We're going a little over time, which is typical of me. Just to briefly run through who we think has written what. Joshua written by Joshua, except for the part where he dies. Judges written by Samuel. 1 and 2 Samuel, principally authored by Samuel. Now, when we say written, don't forget that they're taking into their writing accounts that have probably been floating around. And as we discovered through just like Judges, it's not just a simple hand-fisted history of here's what happened next, here's what happened next, here's what's happened next. It's an incredibly shaped narrative with a particular purpose to it. It's not just, you know, a newspaper report. It's got a very clear structure to it and narrative shape. 1 and 2 Samuel, as it says on the screen there, authored by Samuel, but extended and completed by the prophets Nathan and Gad. And 1 and 2 Kings, written by Jeremiah, building on the writings of the other prophets. And then the themes of those books, this is all we're going to look in a lot more in detail, the apostasy and the sin. We've already seen a little bit of that in what we've reviewed of the opening and closing of those books. And it's nothing new for us to see. It's been something that's been part of what we've seen in Israel, even from the Exodus onwards. But things certainly get out of control after Joshua. So we will be seeing that as a theme, and particularly in the shape of syncretism, worshipping other gods, taking on the religions of the neighbouring nations. We'll see judgment as God fulfills his promise as given through Deuteronomy that he will come against them in their sin. And so God will uphold his justice as part of his covenant with Israel. He won't just sweep it under the carpet. And then what we're all expecting, grace. And we're all expecting that because we're recipients of it and we know the character of God. God is faithful despite what happens in Israel. And he has, despite whatever Israel is doing, God has a trajectory through the Bible of keeping his promises and fulfilling his purposes, even if sometimes he's got to drag Israel by the scruff of the neck to deliver those promises. And we'll see that again and again and again. And yet, I think, spoiler alert, we left at the end of Kings with an unfulfilled expectation. There's got to be something more, which is illustrated here in the end of 2 Kings. On the 27th day, the 12th month, the 37th year of the exile of Judah's King Jehoiachin, evil Merodach, is a name you don't call your child, evil Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year he became king, pardoned King Jehoiachin of Judah and released him from prison. He spoke kindly to him and set his throne over the thrones of the kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiachin changed his prison clothes and dined regularly in the presence of the king of Babylon for the rest of his life. As for his allowance, a regular allowance was given to him by the king, portion for each day for the rest of his life. Sounds nice, doesn't it?
No.
Gets to retire.
That's it because you're a Canadian exile, mate.
It's a cheap concession for a man who will die away from his home, away from his God, away from his people. It leaves us, it leaves us going, no, what has happened? Where have the promises gone? What has happened to these people? And for that, the prophets, if you were part of that overview that we did last year in the promise to fulfillment section, it's from here that the trajectory is picked up by those latter prophets. And the promises that were shaped in this section around the very tangible and physical things like the land, the kingship, and the prosperity are now transformed by the prophets, the latter prophets, into a future hope that is spoken of in different, well, it uses the land and that sort of terminology, but it expresses it in ways that are way beyond the physical realities and way beyond the temporal realities, and talks of much bigger things than simply land, which we see fulfilled in the person of Jesus, but also to be fulfilled in the future hope of the New Testament as well.
So we're not supposed to make any or see any hope out of those last verses about how Jehoiachin was actually given some.
Well, the notes,
peace in his last days.
The notes that we have here, I'm not sure. This is a fragile note of grace.
Yes,
I think that even that might be too generous. I think it's a rather sad picture. It's a rather sad picture. Sure,
because it's not about him; it's about Israel as an identity.
Yeah, and it's illustrated as well in the picture that you get from Ezra, I think, where the new temple, the foundations of a new temple are being made, and the old generation who saw the former temple are in tears. Perhaps tears of joy that a new temple is coming, but tears because it's just nothing like the old temple. They might be back in the land. They might be having their new temple, but they know that this is clearly not what it was meant to be. And so the prophets of that period pick up and project out that new hope that is coming. The hope that we live in now too. Any other thoughts or questions or ideas?
So we're just a postscript. I know this is not strictly relevant to this, but to the conversation we just happened, because this is really bugging me.
Yeah.
Somebody who works for Catholic University.
Yeah.
European Commission figures, just look up people's percentage of Belgium self-identifying as Christian increased by 10% between 2009 and 2019. 62% of the population of Belgium self-identifies as Christian. The vast majority of those are Catholic. So I think we just need to be a little bit careful about sectarian judgmentalism about who does and doesn't count as a Christian.
Look, I agree, and I think that as we look at Belgium, it doesn't surprise me if we've got missionaries coming to Australia because we've got the same issues of people not having a heart for the Lord.
Yeah, I just wonder how we're identified.
Yeah, so I mean, and I highlighted that because it pricked up in me this alignment with how people have lost their way at times. Now, whether it's Belgium, whether it's any other planet. It even emphasises more of the reason why we should be doing PTC course, to be equipping ourselves to be looking at the cycles that actually occur in the Gospels, in the Bible, because it's the same problem today. Because if you don't get people back to the heart of God, then that's what the problem is. They lose sight of what's going on. So, it's the same message that Israel has been told to pass information down to their kids, future generations, etc. So
it's why they want to be separate from the other nations. To avoid the contamination. But I think Christians really are highly contaminated by the society that we live today.
Which is what we'll see more of as we look closer in the old prophets, the former prophets. All right, for next week, I can send out. I think I can send out the notes or maybe I can. I'm not sure if I can send them all. If you're registered, you'll have access to those. Did anybody here order a book?
Yep.
Okay. I'll have to have a look in the office whether they have come or whether they are coming.
Helen doesn't normally put their order into
everyone's registered. Okay. All right.
We can get them online.
You can get them online.
But it's
That's
not
right.
It's not currently online. It was registered.
But that will happen tomorrow morning, is what Helen's told me. So if anyone so she does that final registration. So, well, not final registration. If you want to register, you can register later. We're not. It's more so if you're absolutely sure and you definitely want to book, please make sure you've sorted that out tomorrow morning. Or sorted out with Helen. Either just send her an email and she will include you. And it would be good to have a read, even just a skim read of Joshua for next week, because that'll get you in good stead for where we need to be for next week.
2 weeks time.
2 weeks time. I've given you a schedule, haven't I? Yes. Yeah. I'll reattach that because there's more people in the list, so there is a schedule, and it probably isn't next week. Let me pray for us. Father God, thanks for the introduction to your word in the form of prophets. I pray, Lord, that we would not we would acknowledge that sin is the big problem, the underlying problem that drew your people Israel away from you, that caused so much pain and tragedy. But we also pray, Lord, that you'd help us to look into that more and deeply. And as we analyse these former prophets, recognise in ourselves where we can go wrong, where we can fail to be faithful to your commands, to your words, where we can add to your word or take away from it, and end up displacing ourselves from you. Lord, we thank you that we sit now in a position of grace, knowing that the problems, the sin, the tragedy that happened in those days, you have used. You have brought us to the cross through Jesus and given us the hope of his kingship and his return and the new creation. And Lord, I pray that as we look at this word, that will strengthen our hope in you and our confidence and assurance of our salvation. Amen. All right. Thanks, friends.